America sent troops into Iran. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. By the time those boots touched foreign soil, the war was already lost. Not on the battlefield, but in the financial and geopolitical architecture that the United States has spent 70 years constructing and is now, at this very moment, watching collapse in real time. Stay with me, because what I'm going to lay out in the next 30 minutes will not be found in any newspaper, any cable news broadcast, or any congressional hearing. What you are about to hear is the actual mechanism, the financial, military, and imperial logic behind why America went into Iran, why it was always going to fail, and why the consequences will reshape the global economy in ways that most people are completely unprepared for. Let me begin with what no one in Washington will say plainly. The conflict with Iran is not about nuclear weapons.
It is not about terrorism. It is not about human rights, regional stability, or any of the other rotating humanitarian justifications that the State Department cycles through depending on the news cycle. The conflict with Iran is about oil, dollar pricing, and the existential threat that an independent, resource-rich, strategically positioned Iran poses to the architecture of American financial dominance that I first described in Super Imperialism back in 1972. Everything else, the rhetoric, the sanctions, the proxy wars, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the threats, the posturing, everything else is noise layered on top of that fundamental economic reality.
To understand why, you have to go back to 1971. When Nixon took the United States off the gold standard, he created a problem that most people still don't fully grasp. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical. It was backed by what exactly? By faith? By American military power? Both of those answers are partially right, but the more precise answer is that the dollar was backed by the requirement that global oil trade be denominated in dollars. This is the petrodollar system, and it is the single most important financial arrangement of the last half century. When Saudi Arabia and the United States reached their agreement in 1974, Henry Kissinger doing what Kissinger did, which was to translate military leverage into financial architecture, the deal was essentially this. OPEC would price oil exclusively in dollars, and the United States would guarantee the security of the Gulf monarchies. What this meant in practice was that every country in the world that needed to buy oil, and every country in the world needs to buy oil, had to first acquire dollars. The demand for dollars was thus structurally guaranteed, not by economic productivity, not by American exports, but by the basic energy needs of the entire global economy. Now keep that architecture in your mind, because everything I am about to say flows from it. Iran, since 1979, has been the single most consistent challenger to that arrangement in the entire Middle East.
Not because Iranian leaders are irrational, not because they are simply anti-American by temperament, but because they understand and have understood for decades that the petrodollar system is a mechanism of extraction. It is a system by which the United States collects a kind of imperial tax on the entire global economy simply by controlling the currency in which energy is priced. Iran began trading oil in euros in the early 2000s. It signed bilateral agreements with China and Russia to conduct energy trade in non-dollar currencies.
It joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It became a founding member of the BRICS expansion. Every one of these moves was a direct challenge to the dollar's structural monopoly over global energy pricing. And every one of these moves was met with escalating American hostility. The sanctions, the coups, the support for opposition movements, the drone strikes, and ultimately the deployment of troops. These are not random acts of foreign policy aggression. They are the predictable defensive responses of an empire whose financial foundation is being systematically undermined. But here is what I want you to hold in your mind right now, because this is the part that the financial press will not report. The decision to send American troops into Iran did not happen in a strategic vacuum. It happened at precisely the moment when the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia, were moving with serious momentum toward an alternative reserve currency settlement system. The timing is not coincidental. It never is. When you've spent 50 years studying how empires manage their financial architecture, you learn that military escalation follows financial threat as reliably as night follows day. The troops going into Iran were not sent to defeat Iran. They were sent to send a message to every other country watching. This is what happens when you try to exit the dollar system. And that message, I am going to argue, failed. It failed completely.
And the reasons it failed are structural, not tactical, which means no amount of additional military hardware, no different commanding general, no revised battle plan would have changed the outcome. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you precisely why the empire's military instrument has become decoupled from its financial objectives. And that decoupling is the most important economic story of our time.
Let me start with the arms economy, because this is something I've been analyzing since my days at Chase Manhattan Bank in the 1960s, when I was working on the balance of payments and began to understand how the United States was financing its empire. Here is the basic arithmetic that no politician will state publicly. The United States spends approximately $900 billion per year on its military. When you add in the intelligence budget, Veterans Affairs, and the interest on debt accumulated from past military spending, you get closer to $1.5 trillion annually. This is not the defense budget. Defense budgets defend territory. This is an imperial maintenance budget.
It is the cost of running a global system of military bases, 800 of them spread across 80 countries, whose primary purpose is not to fight wars, but to make the credible threat of war the permanent background condition of global commerce. When American warships patrol the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil transits, they are not there because Iran has threatened to close the strait. They are there because their presence is itself the argument. Price your oil in dollars, conduct your trade within the dollar system, or this is what is waiting for you. The problem, and this is the problem that the deployment into Iran has now made impossible to ignore, is that military presence and military victory are not the same thing. The United States has not won a major war since 1945. Korea was a stalemate. Vietnam was a defeat. Afghanistan was a 20-year catastrophe that ended with the Taliban back in power and $2.3 trillion spent. Iraq was a destabilization that gave Iran more regional influence than it had before the invasion, which is one of history's great strategic ironies, and one that I take no pleasure in noting. Libya was destroyed. Syria was partially destroyed. In every single case, American military power was sufficient to destroy, but insufficient to build. Sufficient to destabilize, but insufficient to control. And now Iran. Iran, which has a population of 88 million people, a highly educated military officer class, ballistic missile systems that can reach every American base in the region, and, crucially, an integrated network of allied forces across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen that constitute what military analysts call the axis of resistance and what I would call, more accurately, the infrastructure of a regional deterrent.
Now, I want to be precise here because precision is what distinguishes analysis from propaganda. When I say America lost before the troops landed, I do not mean that Iranian conventional forces defeated American conventional forces in a pitched battle, though the resistance was fiercer and more coordinated than the Pentagon's public statements acknowledged. What I mean is something more fundamental. I mean that the strategic objectives that justified the deployment, disrupting Iran's nuclear program, decapitating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' command structure, forcing Iran back to the negotiating table on American terms, and sending a deterrent signal to China and Russia about the cost of supporting dollar alternatives, none of those objectives were achieved.
Not one, and the failure to achieve them has done something that no Iranian missile could have done. It has accelerated the timeline of dollar dehegemonization by demonstrating to the entire world that American military power can destroy but cannot dominate, can punish but cannot control. Think about what that means for the financial architecture I described earlier. The petrodollar system works not because every country loves the dollar, but because every country fears the consequences of abandoning it. The system is maintained by the credible threat of what happens to those who exit. Muammar Gaddafi tried to create a gold-backed African currency and was killed. Saddam Hussein switched Iraqi oil sales to euros in 2000 and was invaded 2 years later. And the first thing the Coalition Provisional Authority did after the invasion was switch Iraqi oil back to dollar pricing. The message had always been clear. But now that message has been tested against a country with real deterrent capacity, real regional alliances, real missile technology, and real economic integration into the BRICS alternative architecture, and the message has not held. That is the earthquake, not the military engagement itself, but what the outcome of that engagement communicates to the 85% of humanity that lives outside the NATO alliance and has been watching this unfold with intense, careful attention. Keep watching, because what I'm about to show you next is the domestic financial structure that made this military adventure not just possible, but inevitable. The specific institutions, the specific profit flows, the specific political incentives that mean the American state will keep doing this even as it keeps failing. And understanding that mechanism is the only way to understand why nothing changes despite everything changing.
The defense industry in the United States is not a support system for American foreign policy. Let me be completely clear about that, because the causality runs in the opposite direction from what most people assume. American foreign policy is, in substantial measure, a support system for the defense industry. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Boeing Defense. These are not companies that respond to threats. They are companies that require threats, that depend on threats, that lobby for the identification and amplification of threats in order to justify the contracts that are their lifeblood. When I was doing financial analysis on Wall Street in the 1960s and 70s, what struck me about the defense sector was not its size, but its insularity. These are companies that have essentially one customer, the federal government. And that customer is staffed at the senior levels by people who rotate out of and back into the industry in a cycle so regular and so well documented that Dwight Eisenhower, a 5-star general and 2-term president, felt compelled to warn the American people about it in his farewell address in 1961. Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex. He was right about the problem and wrong about one thing. He thought it could be controlled by democratic vigilance. What he didn't fully anticipate was that the complex would eventually purchase enough of the political system through campaign contributions, through think tank funding, through the revolving door of personnel, that democratic vigilance itself would be neutralized.
The numbers are not abstract. In the fiscal year before the Iran deployment, the Pentagon budget had increased for the 7th consecutive year. Raytheon stock had risen 34% over 18 months. Lockheed Martin had booked over $65 billion in contracts. Congressional districts across 45 states contained defense manufacturing facilities, which means that 90 senators and the vast majority of House members had a direct constituent economic interest in maintaining military spending at current levels or higher. This is not a conspiracy. This is a structural alignment of financial incentives that produces, with mechanical regularity, the political consensus for military action regardless of strategic merit. The Iran deployment was not decided by a careful weighing of strategic costs and benefits. It was decided in an environment where the institutional incentives overwhelmingly favored action, where the think tanks that provide intellectual cover for military intervention are funded by the same defense contractors that profit from it, and where the mainstream media, whose advertising revenue depends in part on the cable news cycle that military conflict generates, had every incentive to amplify the threat narrative and almost none to interrogate the strategic logic.
And here is where the financial architecture becomes truly ingenious and truly corrupt. Because the money spent on the Iran deployment doesn't disappear. It flows. It flows to Raytheon for the Tomahawk missiles, to Lockheed for the F-35 sorties, to General Dynamics for the ground vehicles, to Boeing for the transport aircraft, to 100 smaller contractors for everything from body armor to satellite communications. That money, having been spent by the federal government, is financed by Treasury bond issuance. The bonds are purchased by Wall Street institutions, by foreign central banks, ironically including, until recently, by the very Gulf states whose dollar earnings from oil give them the reserves to buy American debt.
Size. The interest paid on those bonds flows back to the financial sector. The dollars that cycle through this system, from federal spending to defense contractor revenue to Wall Street bond markets to foreign reserve accumulation, are the mechanism by which military Keynesianism sustains the American financial sector even as it hollows out the real economy. This is what I mean when I say war is America's most effective export industry. It does not export a product that other countries want to buy. It exports the financial obligation to use dollars, backed by the demonstrated willingness to use force against those who refuse. But, and this is the turn that everything in this analysis is building toward, that mechanism requires that the force work. It requires that the demonstration be convincing. And in Iran, it was not convincing. The missiles were fired. The bases were struck. The troops were deployed. And Iran did not capitulate, did not fracture, did not beg to return to the JCPOA on American terms. Its government remained intact. Its regional alliances remained intact. Its energy export arrangements with China, conducted in yuan, not dollars, continued. Its membership in BRICS continued. Its integration into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization continued. And every government in the global south that had been watching, every government that had been calculating whether the risk of exiting the dollar system was worth the economic benefits, looked at what happened in Iran and updated its calculation, not away from caution, but toward a conclusion that is devastating for American financial hegemony. The emperor's military sword, it turns out, is not sharp enough to cut through a determined, well-armed, regionally integrated adversary. And if it is not sharp enough for Iran, what does that say about its deterrent value against China over Taiwan, or against Russia over Eastern Europe, or against any of the other flashpoints where American military credibility is the only thing standing between the current world order and a genuinely multipolar one?
The question I left you was this. If American military power has proven insufficient to discipline Iran, a regional power of 88 million people with serious but still limited conventional military capacity, what does that mean for the broader architecture of dollar hegemony that military credibility has underwritten for the last 70 years? I want to answer that question with the precision it deserves, because the answer is not simply, America is declining. That is a bumper sticker, not an analysis. The answer is structural. It is institutional. It is embedded in the specific mechanisms by which the dollar system reproduces itself and the specific ways in which those mechanisms are now, for the first time since Bretton Woods, failing simultaneously rather than sequentially. When multiple load-bearing pillars of a structure fail at the same time, the building does not lean.
It collapses, and we are right now in the early phases of that collapse, not of America as a nation, but of America as the organizing principle of the global financial order. Let me take you to the bond market, because that is where the real war is being fought and where the real losses are being recorded. When the United States deploys troops, it does not pay for that deployment out of tax revenue. The United States has not run a meaningful budget surplus since the Clinton administration, and even those surpluses were accounting artifacts rather than genuine fiscal discipline. Military operations are financed by debt, by the issuance of treasury bonds, which are sold to domestic and foreign buyers who lend the American government money at interest. The total federal debt as of the Iran deployment had exceeded $34 trillion. The annual interest payment on that debt had crossed $1 trillion for the first time in American history, meaning that the United States was spending more on debt service than on its entire discretionary non-military budget. Now that system works, or rather it has worked, as long as there is sufficient global demand for treasury bonds to keep interest rates manageable and keep the dollar strong. And global demand for treasury bonds has historically been maintained by the petrodollar recycling system. Oil exporting countries earn dollars from oil sales, accumulate dollar reserves, and park those reserves in treasury bonds. The Gulf states, running current account surpluses from oil revenue, have been among the largest purchasers of American debt for decades. This is the circular flow that makes American military spending self-financing in a way that no other country's military spending can be. America spends dollars on weapons. Those weapons enforce the oil pricing system. The oil pricing system generates dollar earnings for Gulf states, and Gulf states recycle those earnings back into American bonds, the empire finances itself.
But here is what the Iran operation has broken, and broken in a way that may not be repairable within the existing system. Saudi Arabia, which signed a currency swap agreement with China in 2023 and began accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases, watched the Iran deployment and drew a conclusion that no American diplomat can afford to acknowledge publicly: that American military protection, which is the price Saudi Arabia pays for dollar pricing of its oil, is becoming strategically less reliable at precisely the moment when the economic costs of that arrangement are becoming more visible. The Gulf Cooperation Council states are not ideologically opposed to the United States. They are transactional. They have always been transactional.
And the transaction is changing because the asset they are purchasing, American security guarantees, has depreciated in value as American military credibility has depreciated. When you see Saudi Arabia joining BRICS in 2024, when you see the UAE conducting trade in dirhams and yuan, when you see Qatar quietly diversifying its reserve holdings away from treasuries, you are not seeing a sudden outbreak of anti-American sentiment. You are seeing rational actors repricing a financial arrangement whose terms have shifted. And that repricing, once it reaches critical mass, unwinds the petrodollar recycling mechanism that has made American debt sustainable for 50 years. Now, stay with me here, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely alarming. Not in a theatrical sense, but in the sense that the arithmetic is inexorable and the timeline is compressing. If the Gulf states reduce their treasury bond purchases, and the data shows they are already doing so, the Federal Reserve faces a choice with no good options. It can raise interest rates to attract alternative buyers, which increases the cost of servicing a $34 trillion debt and risks triggering a domestic recession and a wave of sovereign debt crises in developing countries that have borrowed in dollars. Or it can monetize the debt, print money to buy its own bonds, which risks the kind of inflationary spiral that destroys the purchasing power of dollar savings and erodes the fundamental attractiveness of dollar-denominated assets. Either path leads to a structural weakening of the dollar's global position. The Iran deployment did not create this dilemma, but it accelerated the timeline by which it must be confronted, because it accelerated the timeline on which America's key financial partners are diversifying away from the dollar architecture. And acceleration in systems that are already under stress is the difference between a managed transition and a crisis.
I want to talk about Israel now, because no analysis of the Middle East financial architecture is complete without it, and because the conventional discourse on this subject, whether from the pro-Israel right or the humanitarian left, almost entirely misses the structural function that Israel performs within the American imperial system. I am not going to moralize about Israeli domestic politics or the specific conduct of Israeli military operations. What I am going to do is describe, as precisely as I can, what Israel is from the perspective of American grand strategy and imperial financial architecture. Israel is a forward military base, an intelligence platform, a testing ground for American weapon systems, and a political instrument for managing Arab domestic politics across the Middle East.
It is not an ally in the conventional sense, a partner with independent strategic interests that happen to align with American interests. It is a node in the American imperial infrastructure, maintained at enormous cost, approximately $4 billion in direct military aid annually, plus the incalculable cost of the diplomatic capital spent defending Israeli actions at the United Nations, in international courts, and in bilateral relationships with every country in the global South that watches American policy toward Palestine and draws conclusions about American credibility as a rule of law actor. What I've been arguing for years, and what the Iran deployment makes undeniable, is that the cost of maintaining Israel as a strategic asset has begun to exceed the strategic value it provides. Let me be specific. The Israeli military operations in Gaza, which killed over 40,000 Palestinians and destroyed virtually the entire civilian infrastructure of one of the most densely populated territories on Earth, were conducted with American weapons, financed with American money, and protected by American diplomatic vetoes in the Security Council. The images of that destruction were broadcast in real time to every country in the global south. Every country in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that has been lectured by American diplomats about the rules-based international order, about human rights, about the responsibility to protect. Every one of those countries watched American weapons being used to destroy hospitals and schools and refugee camps, and every one of those countries updated its assessment of what American claims about rules and values are actually worth. This is not a humanitarian observation, this is a strategic one. The dollar system depends partly on the perception that America leads a legitimate international order. When that legitimacy is visibly, undeniably, catastrophically destroyed, as it was in Gaza and as it was again in the Iran deployment, the soft power dimension of dollar hegemony erodes alongside the hard power dimension.
And here is what ties Gaza to Iran to the BRICS challenge in a single coherent architecture that I want you to be able to articulate to anyone who asks you what is really happening in the Middle East. The destruction of Palestinian civil society, the containment of Iranian regional influence, and the military pressure on any state that attempts to exit the dollar system are not three separate policies. They are three expressions of a single policy. The maintenance, by any means necessary, of the American financial empire's control over the most strategically important energy-producing region on Earth. Gaza matters because Hamas, whatever its internal politics, is part of the regional resistance infrastructure that limits American and Israeli freedom of action in the Middle East. Iran matters because Iran is the primary state sponsor of that resistance infrastructure, and because Iran's independent energy diplomacy with China and Russia represents the most advanced real-world example of what a post-dollar energy trading system looks like. And the BRICS alternative currency project matters because it is the institutional framework within which all of these individual de-dollarization moves could eventually coalesce into a coherent alternative to the Bretton Woods system. What the American military and financial establishment has never fully reckoned with, and I say this as someone who has spent 50 years watching them not reckon with it, is that you cannot bomb your way out of a monetary crisis. Military force can destroy infrastructure, it can kill leaders,
it can occupy territory. What it cannot do is compel the global economy to prefer a currency whose underlying economic logic has been fatally compromised. The dollar's hegemony was built on three pillars: American industrial and export dominance, which gave the world a reason to hold dollars because they could be used to buy American goods; the Bretton Woods institutional framework, which gave the dollar formal legal primacy in international transactions; and the petrodollar energy pricing system, which gave the dollar structural necessity regardless of what anyone thought of American products or institutions. The first pillar, industrial dominance, has been gone since the 1970s. The United States is a net importer. It runs the largest current account deficit in world history. The second pillar, Bretton Woods institutional primacy, has been eroded by decades of American willingness to weaponize the dollar through sanctions, which have taught every country in the world that holding dollar reserves means holding assets that can be frozen or confiscated by the American Treasury Department at any moment of political disagreement. When the United States froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves in 2022, it did not punish Russia as effectively as intended. Russia continued to export oil, continued to fund its military operations, and continued to grow economically in ways that confounded American predictions. What it did do was send an unambiguous message to China, India, Saudi Arabia, and every other country holding dollar reserves. Your money is not safe. That message, delivered at a moment when the BRICS alternative was already gaining momentum, accelerated the process of reserve diversification by years. And the Iran deployment is another iteration of the same message, delivered through military rather than financial means, but communicating the same underlying reality. America will use whatever instrument of power it has available to maintain its hegemony, and that willingness to use power is itself evidence that the hegemony is no longer self-sustaining.
Keep watching, because the next piece of this analysis is the one that connects everything to you, to your savings, your pension, the price of goods you buy, the interest rate on your mortgage, because the end of dollar hegemony
is not an abstraction. It is an economic event that will be experienced in the daily material lives of ordinary Americans in ways that no one in political leadership is preparing the public to understand. The domestic consequences of this imperial overreach follow a pattern that is as old as empire itself, and which I traced in detail in The Destiny of Civilization.
When an empire overextends militarily, the costs of that overextension are not borne by the financial class that benefits from the imperial system. They are borne by the domestic population through inflation, through the erosion of public services, through the degradation of infrastructure, through the slow strangulation of productive investment as capital flows into the military financial complex rather than into the industries and institutions that sustain ordinary life. The Roman denarius was debased to pay for imperial military campaigns. The British pound lost its reserve currency status in the aftermath of 2 world wars that left Britain with debts it could not service. The pattern is consistent across history, and the American version is following it with a fidelity that would be impressive if it were not so devastating. Here is what that means in concrete terms for the American economy in the wake of the Iran deployment. The deployment was financed by additional treasury issuance at a moment when foreign demand for treasuries was already declining. The Federal Reserve, facing the choice I described earlier, chose a path of partial monetization, effectively printing money to cover the gap between what the market would willingly absorb and what the government needed to issue. The result was an inflationary pulse that hit commodity prices first, oil, food, industrial metals, and then passed through to consumer prices in the ways that Americans experienced at grocery stores and gas stations. The political establishment, with its customary combination of bad faith and genuine confusion, attributed this inflation to supply chain disruptions and corporate greed, both of which are real, but neither of which is the fundamental cause. The fundamental cause is the fiscal cost of imperial overreach being monetized through currency debasement. This is not a new story. It is the oldest story in monetary history, but it is a story that the economics profession, with its narrow technical focus on interest rate mechanics and its institutional dependence on the financial sector whose interests it largely serves, is structurally incapable of telling honestly. I want to address the mainstream economists directly here because I think it is important to be specific about the intellectual failure involved.
The dominant schools of macroeconomics, whether the new Keynesian models that dominate the Federal Reserve and the IMF, or the supply side frameworks that dominate right-wing think tanks, or the modern monetary theory variants that have gained some popularity on the left, all share a fundamental blind spot. They treat the dollar's reserve currency status as a given, as a background condition, rather than as a historically contingent arrangement that has specific preconditions, specific beneficiaries, and specific vulnerabilities. When I have raised in academic conferences and in my published work the question of what happens to American fiscal capacity when the petrodollar recycling mechanism breaks down, the response has almost invariably been some version of the dollar is the reserve currency because there is no alternative, as if the absence of a fully developed alternative at this moment means that no alternative can ever develop.
That is not economics. That is the intellectual equivalent of a 19th century British economist explaining that the pound sterling will always be the world's reserve currency because there is no alternative to it. There was an alternative. It took time to develop. And when it was ready, the transition happened with a speed that confounded everyone who had assumed the existing arrangement was permanent. The yuan is not yet a full reserve currency. The BRICS alternative settlement system is not yet fully operational. The non-dollar energy trading arrangements between Russia, China, India, and Iran are not yet sufficiently large to destabilize the dollar system on their own. All of that is true. But what the Iran deployment has done is change the political will calculation in a decisive way. Countries that were considering moving toward dollar alternatives but were deterred by the military and financial risks of doing so have watched the United States deploy troops into Iran and fail to achieve its strategic objectives, and they have drawn the rational conclusion that the deterrent value of American military power is lower than they had previously estimated. When the expected cost of exiting the dollar system falls, The expected benefit of exiting, which has always been substantial in the form of eliminating the structural transfer of wealth to the United States that the reserve currency system entails, begins to dominate the calculation. That is where we are, not at the end of the dollar, but at the moment when the decision calculus shifted irreversibly in the direction of exit.
And I want to be clear about what that structural transfer of wealth actually means, because it is the heart of what superimperialism was about and what I have spent 50 years trying to make people understand. The reserve currency system is not a neutral technical arrangement. It is a tribute system. Every country that holds dollar reserves is lending money to the United States at below market rates because the demand for dollars as a reserve asset keeps American borrowing costs lower than they would otherwise be.
Every country that prices its commodities in dollars is subsidizing the American financial sector because the intermediation of global commodity trade through dollar markets generates fee income, spread income, and information advantages for Wall Street institutions. Every country that accepts dollar-denominated IMF loans as a condition of financial assistance is accepting a structural adjustment program designed not to develop their economy, but to open it to American financial penetration. The privatization of public assets, the elimination of capital controls, the integration of domestic financial markets into the global dollar system in ways that extract value rather than create it. This is the empire, not the troops, not the bases, not the aircraft carriers, though those are its enforcement mechanisms. The empire is the financial architecture that ensures a net flow of resources from the periphery to the center, from the global south to Wall Street, from the labor of billions of people in developing countries to the balance sheets of American financial institutions. Iran understood this. That is why Iran was targeted. That is why every country that has seriously attempted to build an alternative from Venezuela to Libya to Iraq to Zimbabwe has been destabilized, sanctioned, or invaded. And that is why the failure of the Iran deployment is not just a military setback. It is a systemic event. It is the moment when the enforcement mechanism of the empire demonstrated publicly and irreversibly that it has limits. And empires whose enforcement mechanisms have visible limits are not empires that reform and adapt. They are empires that enter the phase of accelerating decline, grasping harder for control as control becomes less achievable, spending more on coercion as coercion becomes less effective, and ultimately consuming themselves in the attempt to maintain by force what they can no longer maintain by consent or by structural advantage. What does this mean for you, for the person watching this video trying to understand what is happening and what to do about it? It means first that the economic disruptions you are experiencing, the inflation, the stagnating real wages, the erosion of public services, the sense that the productive economy is being hollowed out to feed something you cannot quite name, are not accidents and they are not mysteries. They are the domestic cost of imperial overreach being passed down to the population that is least able to absorb it and least represented in the political system that makes the decisions. It means, second, that the trajectory of this system is not toward stabilization.
The response to every failure of American imperial policy has been to double down. More sanctions, more military deployments, more pressure on countries attempting to exit the dollar system. And each doubling down accelerates the very trends it is designed to reverse. And it means, third, that understanding this architecture, being able to see it, name it, trace its mechanisms, is not a luxury. It is the precondition for any serious political response.
Serious. What I have argued for 50 years and what the evidence continues to support with devastating consistency is that the choice is not between the current dollar system and chaos. The choice is between a managed, negotiated transition to a multipolar monetary system, one in which no single country has the ability to weaponize the global reserve currency, and a disorderly, crisis-driven collapse of the existing system that will be enormously destructive for everyone, including the American people who will be told right up until the moment it fails that everything is fine. The Iran deployment was the moment when the managed transition became more difficult and the disorderly collapse became more likely, because it demonstrated that the American political system, captured as it is by the financial and military interests that profit from the existing arrangement, cannot make the strategic retreats and compromises that a successful managed transition would require, it can only escalate, and escalation against a world that is no longer deterred is not a strategy. It is the final phase of an empire that has run out of ideas. The soldiers who were sent into Iran did not fail because they were not brave or capable. They failed because they were sent to accomplish something that military force cannot accomplish: the restoration of financial credibility that has been structurally undermined over decades by the very policies those soldiers were sent to enforce. That is the tragedy. And it is a tragedy that will be repeated with diminishing returns and increasing costs until the American political class either develops the wisdom to understand what is happening or is forced by events to confront it. History, unfortunately, suggests that wisdom rarely arrives before events, but the events are arriving. They are arriving faster than the institutions of the American empire can adapt to them. And what comes next? The restructuring of the global monetary system, the rebalancing of economic power toward Asia and the global south, the painful domestic reckoning with 50 years of imperial financialization is not a story that will be told honestly by the people who built the system. It will have to be told by the people who were willing to look at it clearly, name its mechanisms accurately, and refuse to look away.